You might want to put your food down, because I'm not here to talk about all the fascinating art and culture from ancient Greece. I'm getting into the nasty stuff. Medicinal sweat scrapings, bizarre and disgusting deaths. What are some of the grossest facts from ancient Greece? Let's dive right in. Exercise was very important in ancient Greece, and in gymnasiums and athletic performances, you had peasants or slaves who were tasked with scraping all the sweat and oil off the athletes' bodies. Yes, oil, they'd often oil themselves up just to look extra toned and glorious. All the sweat and oil was referred to as Gloios and would be scraped off the body with a curved blunt blade called a strigil. Now, this is already a gross enough task on its own, but the extra nasty bit is what the oil and sweat concoction was used for afterwards. Yeah, it wasn't just disposed of, it was often collected and sold. It was believed that Gloios was effective for healing a variety of ailments, including reducing genital infections and inflammations of the rectum. Have you spat out your yogurt yet? The sweat, oil, BLOOD, and sand would also be scraped off of wrestlers' bodies and sold as well. This practice wasn't unique to ancient Greece either. Ancient Rome had a similar belief, with scrapings of dead skin from bathtubs used by gladiators, or parts of dead gladiators' bodies being used to cure ailments like epilepsy. And no, it didn't actually work. We often learn about all the terrible plagues and illnesses that spread across medieval England, but there were some pretty nasty plagues in ancient Greece as well, like the Plague of Athens. This plague hit Athens in 430 BC, and it was devastating. It eventually started to recede, but it kept coming back. Next in 429, and then again in 427, finally easing off by 426 BC. This epidemic was responsible for killing off Heraclitus, the Athenian statesman and general, as well as many others. The exact cause of the plague is still a bit of a mystery. Could have been influenza, typhus, typhoid fever, bubonic plague, smallpox, measles. Kinda hard to figure it out for certain now, but one thing is clear: the death toll was high. An estimated 75 to 100,000 people died during the outbreaks over the course of those 4 years, which was about a quarter of the city's population. The loss significantly weakened Athens during the Peloponnesian War and probably contributed to its eventual defeat. I know what question is on everyone's mind right now. Well, what did the ancient Greeks use to wipe with? I know you're just itching to find out. Was it grass, leaves? Did they not even bother wiping it all and just bathe it all off? No, they used bits of pottery. Anyone watching just clench up as soon as I said that? I certainly did when digging into this and the word pottery came up. I know what you're thinking: sharp objects wiping in and around the rectum. No wonder they needed human sweat and oil concoctions to cure their inflamed butts. Well, it actually wasn't as horrifying as it sounds, at least not always. The pottery pieces were called Ostraca and were smoothed out and rounded so as not to cause scrapes and cuts, if you were lucky, that is. Fun fact, bits of Ostraca have been found with people's names written on them. Not entirely clear why, but one possibility is that they'd write down the name of someone they didn't like before wiping. Might start keeping a pen next to my toilet paper from now on. Could be cathartic. The 6th century BC philosopher Heraclitus was a major influence on philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Unfortunately for Heraclitus though, his legacy will always be stained by his bizarre and rather revolting death. Suffering from what at the time was called dropsy, where fluid accumulates in the body, Heraclitus tried to get help from physicians at first, but just wasn't convinced that the conventional treatments were going to work. So he covered himself in cow dung instead, which seems like a reasonable alternative. His idea was that the heat generated from the dung would somehow help evaporate all the excess fluid, which of course didn't work. There's some debate as to whether he just died of his condition, covered in excrement, or if things got even worse. Some versions of the story go that he met an even more grisly fate, becoming trapped in the dung, either because it dried up or because it acted a bit like quicksand. And when he tried to call out for help, a gang of rabid dogs rushed over and devoured him, which would have been one of the worst tasting meals they'd probably ever had. Ancient Athens has this reputation for its advancements in democracy and intellectual progress, and there's definitely truth in that, but not everything was ahead of its time, like the slavery. A large portion of the population were either slaves or non-citizens without full rights. Only those born in Athens or from Athenian families could be full citizens, leaving a lot of other folks without a say. These non-citizens, known as nationals, could live and do business in Athens but had limited rights. Now, estimating the number of slaves in Athens is a bit tricky because population figures from ancient times can be unreliable, but around 432 BC, it's believed that there were roughly 150,000 citizens, 50,000 nationals, and about 100,000 slaves. So slavery was a pretty big part of Athenian society. They'd perform various tasks from chores to skilled labor. Their labor was essential for the functioning of the society. Have you ever tasted your own earwax before? Am I the only one? It was by accident, but it wasn't pleasant. But, at least it was my own. God forbid I ever had to taste someone else's, but that's exactly what doctors like Hippocrates did back in ancient Greece. Hippocrates, who lived from 460 to 375 BC, was a revolutionary doctor for the time. He believed that there were bodily reasons for illnesses rather than the gods interfering with the human body. His practice revolved around what he called the four humors: black bile, yellow bile, BLOOD, and phlegm. And you can guess where I'm going with this. He would taste some of these bodily fluids in order to determine his patient's health. In case you're wondering, bitter earwax was a good sign, was a problem. And I probably don't need to tell you this, but you don't need to bother tasting your own earwax, unless you're curious for whatever reason, which I kind of am, but I'm not going to go there. Drowning, burning to death, being buried alive. These are often thought of as some of the worst ways to go, but what about being smothered by hundreds of people's foul-smelling undergarments? Yeah, that would suck. But it's exactly what happened to Draco, the lawgiver. Ever wondered where the term draconian came from? It's this guy, a politician in ancient Athens responsible for having created an incredibly harsh penal system. Well, the story goes that when he revealed his new policies to a crowd of wealthy Greeks, they were so excited and enamored with the guy that they not only jumped for joy, but began tearing off everything they had on and tossing it at him. Hats, tunics, whatever they had on. So much clothing rained down on the guy that he ended up being smothered to death, which is hilarious. Next up, we have the wine test. And no, I'm not referring to an ancient Greek version of a wine tasting. The wine test was often the first step in determining whether a newborn was worthy of being a Spartan. Spartans were about as hardcore as it gets in terms of raising their sons to be hardened warriors. Literally from birth, they were being put in life or death situations like dunking them in wine. It's believed that if they convulsed and cried, they were too weak to be a Spartan and would either be left to die or they'd be sold off as a slave. If they passed the test though, the father would take them to a council of elders who would inspect to make sure there were no birth defects, and if there were, once again, it would be discarded. If it was deemed healthy though, the boy would be raised to become a Spartan. Alright, so this next one isn't really gross, but it's so completely bonkers that I just couldn't help myself from throwing it on here anyway. It's the death of ancient Greek philosopher Pythagoras. There's always been this joke that the guy really hated beans. In reality though, it's kind of the opposite. You see, he believed that humans and beans were closely connected. He once did an experiment even where he buried beans and then observed them, and he said they looked a bit like human fetuses when unearthed weeks later, apparently. So from that point on, of course, he figured that beans had souls of their own. So harming or eating them was a big no-no. That's the whole fear of beans thing. He just didn't eat them. Well, Pythagoras refused to admit a man named Chilon into a commune that he'd built, where everyone would sit around and philosophize about beans, I guess. Wanting so badly to be a part of the bean club though, Chilon rallied a mob to seek revenge on Pythagoras. Pythagoras ran for his life, but soon found himself standing before a field of beans. So now he had a real moral conundrum on his hands. Run into the field and risk crushing and destroying all these precious beans, or allow himself to be caught. Well, he chose not to cross the field and died at the hands of the angry mob. How brave, how noble, how sadly and hilariously misguided. And finally, we have number one. And I'm not referring to number one as the number one spot, I mean number one as in the use of number 1. Urine. In ancient Greece and Rome, urine had some unusual uses. For starters, it was sometimes used as a cleaning agent, particularly for laundry. Its ammonia content made it effective at removing stains and odors from clothing, only then they'd smell like urine, but what can you do? Some Greeks even used urine as mouthwash to whiten their teeth. Once again, the ammonia was thought to have whitening properties, only then your breath would smell like urine. But hey, better to look good than to smell good, right? I think. Alright, well I hope you've managed to keep your food down after this. I apologize for any loss in appetite you might have for the rest of the day, but hey, you clicked the video. I've been your host James, and I will catch you in the future.